This preview video meant to guide you somewhat briefly throughout the historical context around which Paradise Lost is written, and also some bits about the life of its author, John Milton, which I think is really interesting, surprisingly. So I'll try not to get too much into the weeds on any of these things. I just like to present to my students and also you what I think might be helpful or interesting bits of information that can make the reading of Paradise Lost an even more rich experience. First of all, it's important when we're reading, I think, particularly an older, difficult book like Paradise Lost, it's important to acknowledge what it is. And it's an epic poem. And that epic doesn't mean, in the context of literature, it's different than in the context of popular culture, where epic simply means like great or awesome. Epic is a particular kind of story. So there's 4 bits of the definition that I'd like to share with you, and I am taking this definition from John Green's Crash Course video on the Odyssey, because I think it's a really helpful definition. The first epic I experienced was the first movie I ever saw in the theater. You can be jealous if you want. I was 4, and my mother took me to see the original Star Wars, not the prequel stuff, but the original Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And I didn't realize it at the time, and I'm not sure if my mother did or other people did, but it begins in episode 4, which is peculiar, but that's borrowed directly from the epic tradition of starting right in the middle of a serious moment. So, want to review epic traditions? A rewatch of some Star Wars films is a good way to do that. So, there are 4 criteria that John Green presents for an epic, and I think these are really helpful. First, epic is a long narrative poem. Again, I would have these in your notes. A long narrative poem. It is long. In the early stages of Paradise Lost, we get a catalog of demons. In the early stages of the Iliad, you get a catalog of ships. I think in the Iliad, too, you get a long description of Achilles' shield. There are moments where a modern reader can be tempted to say, hurry up, get to the action, get to the key moments of the plot. But in epic poetry, there's always a reason to pay attention to what it's paying attention to. And that's the sort of deeper reading that you want to engage in. So, for example, if there's a few epic similes tied to Satan's size in book 1, hint, which there will be, it isn't Milton simply showing off. He's actually telling you interesting things about Satan beyond physical description. Same with Achilles' shield. Same with the catalog of demons and the catalog of ships in the Iliad. So it's long, and it's narrative. It tells a story. So a long narrative poem. Secondly, an epic is written on a serious subject. So decidedly not funny. I think there's some accidentally funny moments in the Odyssey, and there is laughter in Paradise Lost, but it's peculiar, and we'll discuss it. This is actually the moment where Odysseus kills the suitors. Spoiler alert, but you had like 3,000 years to read it. So the subject has very high stakes. It's often the fate of a culture hangs in the balance. And modern sort of iterations of this, again, go back to Star Wars, where, Luke and Han Solo and that gang doing what they have to do. The whole galaxy is at stake, right? Borrowing from the epic tradition, Bilbo and Frodo doing their job in The Lord of the Rings determines the fate of Middle-earth. This is serious subject, right? Third, an epic is written in a particular way, and I'd like to very regularly be mindful of this, because it isn't simply a plot, a set of events. It's a highly stylized thing. It's written in a grand and elevated style. This is Emily Wilson's beginning of the Odyssey, her translation. And again, this has to do with epic and Homeric similes, which we'll spend a lot of time with, which Milton largely reinvents in his poem, and great speeches and epic descriptions of, buildings and objects. And so I suggest, relaxing your mind, turning every device off. And the key to this is to take moments you would normally skim in a modern novel and go slower in a book like Paradise Lost, and just luxuriate in the detailed description in the grand and elevated style of the poem. And lastly, it's about a larger than life hero. Sadly, there are no English teacher epic heroes. I dream of it, but sadly, it's not the case. This is Achilles, who didn't skip arm or leg day, and Odysseus, who insists on rowing his ship, his boat. Um, but the hero is larger than life, which means that person's actions determine the fate of whole entire civilizations. And that's just really important. Epics are not only written in a particular way, but the stakes of the actions are always super high because of the people in them. Okay, so I just want to walk through kind of incredibly briefly um, some bits about John Milton's life. That's the first sort of manuscript page of what I think is the second edition. The first edition of Paradise Lost, which is published in 1667, I believe, was written in 10 books, and the second edition was extended to 12 books. So he's born in 1608. You don't need to know it was Bread Street, but it does say he's two things, poet and statesman. So we'll discuss that later. But 1608 is interesting, right? Shakespeare leaves London for the suburbs a few years after that. So their lives cross. Shakespeare died in 1616, but their lives would have crossed. And Milton's first major poem was a dedication to Shakespeare. So we're going to see Shakespeare's fingerprints sort of all over Paradise Lost. But anyway, he was born in 1608. One of the most interesting things about Milton was his intellectual capacity and his ability to basically internalize and memorize anything he read in any language. So, like a lot of boys of the day, his educational experience didn't involve phys ed, computer science. Um, it was Latin. Learning Latin vocabulary and syntax and grammar, translating Latin, going from English to Latin, Latin to English. So he had intimate knowledge of Latin and then eventually Greek and then eventually Hebrew. And his early reading, to a great extent, determined who he became. And he valued imaginative literature sort of above all else. That, and I would say personal freedom above all else. He would read often as a boy by a candle in his room until midnight. And we'll see what the effects of that were. But he was an omnivorous and voracious reader. And from a very early age, I would say, too, something that's important for our purposes is when he's reading epic poetry like the Aeneid and like the Odyssey and the Iliad, and even reading scripture. Even as a young person, he has grand designs to compose something great, also, something that would compete with the greatest literature ever. So I'm skipping over a lot, but another element of his life has to do with politics. So you might know in 1649, Charles I is beheaded. King Charles I is beheaded. And Milton is on the side of Cromwell, on the side of the newer Republican government. And he ends up being the Secretary of Foreign Tongues, which is a peculiar title, but he would basically translate all sort of diplomatic documents for the government. So he was heavily involved in Cromwell's government. And here are some documents and some pamphlets he wrote. Pamphlets were very popular. Some pamphlets he wrote, which were interesting. He wanted to divorce his first wife. She had different political opinions than him, and similar to now, but in a more life and death way. It had terrible effects on their marriage. So he wanted to divorce his wife, and it wasn't an easy thing to do. So he actually did something no one else had ever done. It wasn't simply an argument for divorce. It was a biblical argument for divorce on the grounds of incompatibility. Because just as is the case now, divorces don't always happen because of some apocalyptic event. There are just times where people are incompatible, irrevocably so. And he argued using the Bible for the possibility of divorce. So he felt people should have the freedom to determine their own marital status. Here, in his defense of the English people, again, everything's in Latin, but he actually argues that a population should have the right to kill their king. This is an argument for regicide, a philosophical argument for the necessity of regicide when needed, right? And then Probably the document that I find most important when reading Paradise Lost is the Areopagitica right here. I would have that in your notes. And he says it's an anti-censorship document. It was really difficult to get things published in Shakespeare's day and Milton's day. And Milton had this really strong independence streak. And he says this quotation that I would write down. He said, "I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue. I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue," which means your virtue isn't virtue if you don't expose yourself to lots of different kinds of people and lots of different kinds of books and lots of different kinds of opinions. If you surround yourself or cloister yourself or close yourself in an echo chamber of all like opinions, that isn't virtuous. That's just sort of a wimpy self-protection. So, sidebar, and I am getting into the weeds, but just for a second because it's interesting. He called it the Areopagitica, but because he knew that St. Paul preached in Greece. He preached the gospel message in Greece at the Areopagus, it was called. And he was preaching and doing really well. And then the minute he started talking about the resurrection of the body to a group of Greeks who were steeped in Platonic philosophy that, saw the body as more of a receptacle for the soul, but the body wasn't really the essential part of who we are, he started preaching the resurrection of the body to these Greeks at the Areopagus. They booed him off the stage. So even the title Areopagus has to do with what do we do with challenging information, right? Milton's always working on us. So you notice with these three documents that his greatest good, it seems, is the idea of personal liberty. And it's important to note, too, for those interested in American politics, that the Founding Fathers, along with Rousseau and Locke and other political philosophers, deeply read Milton. And some scholars believe that there wouldn't be an America, or there wouldn't be this America, without John Milton. On the personal front, I think he would have been a Stevie Wonder fan before you ask. But on the personal front, the latter stages of his life were as challenging as you could imagine. So as you know, in 1660, Charles II, the son of Charles I, returns from exile in France, takes over the government. The Republican government disintegrates, and the leaders of that government are mostly put to death. So you figure Milton is dead meat. Through a bunch of intercessions from powerful friends, Milton's life is saved. And in 1652, so before that occurs, in 1652, he loses his sight. Read with good lighting, folks. He loses his wife after childbirth, his beloved wife, Mary, and he loses his only son, John. This happens in 1 year, these three things: his sight, his wife, and his son. And then 8 years later, he loses his government, and Charles II here takes over. And Milton ends up being a sort of man without a country and blind. And he's in just existentially a very different place. This is the frontispiece from the first edition of Paradise Lost from 1667. This is the heavy metal band Paradise Lost also. That's a thing. And Paradise Lost took the world by storm, as I'll say later. It's the very first poem like it in English. There isn't a poem like it. It's the only long English poem. It's the first long English poem that doesn't rhyme. And it simply attempts more than any other work of English literature, I believe, ever written. And I'm going to walk through the poem itself, but it attempts, in a world of loss for Milton, in a world of pain, in a world of misery to a large extent, it tries to assert that God is good and all-powerful. And his conclusion of his introduction to the poem is that he hopes to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. It's about the boldest thesis statement ever written. And he dies in 1674. It says author of Paradise Lost here, where he's buried, which is significant because he's a lot more than that. He wrote Paradise Lost blind. He wrote it blind. He said that he slept at night and it came to him at night, and he would dictate it through to various amanuenses or scribes, and they would write it out. So he would dictate unrhymed iambic pentameter lines by the hundreds, which is really just breathtaking. So I hope this introduction helps. It's extremely brief, I admit, but Milton himself as a political thinker is important. Milton's personal life is interesting and important. The history of the time is important. You see all of it resonating, and I know some of my students, enter books like this through sort of political theory, and some enter it through history, and some enter it through theology and philosophy, and some are interested in the author's life, and some can enter it just as a work of literature. And I think there's various entry points to great books. So what I wanted to do is just sort of highlight a few possibilities. But I hope this video helps you.